Hello, and welcome back to the Forgotten Stars YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name is Kelly Settinger. I'm an indie writer, budding photographer, and an itinerant dreamer living in the Buffalo and Niagara region of Western New York. What I'm going to do today is dip my toes in the BookTube area. I'm going to start with go through some of my best reads from 2023. I know I'm kind of several months behind the curve on this. A lot of people, especially booktubers I follow, do their best ofs actually in the December of the year in question. I'm not a big fan of that simply because I'm still reading in December. I don't consider the year over until it's actually over. And this past year, that turned out in my favor. I actually read something really awesome very late in the year that I finished on like December 30th, and we'll get into that in just a minute. Take these off so I can read my notes. I'm going to cite today 3 novels, 3 graphic novels, 3 nonfiction books that I read in 2024. These are all books that had a major effect on me in my reading life last year. I also did a little bit of rereading of a couple of favorite books from years past. I'll mention those as well. I'm going to start with the graphic novels. All right, 2 graphic novels by a man named Bill Griffith. He came on my radar when I read an article, I believe is shared on Facebook from the Atlantic Monthly, a review of a graphic novel he'd written called 3 Rocks, the story of Ernie Bushmiller, the man who created Nancy. If you're familiar with Nancy, the comic strip, it's been around for forever. As long as there's been comic strips and newspapers, Nancy's been there. The kind of humor in Nancy tends to be, there's kind of subtle wordplay, but there's also some absurdity involved. As it follows this little girl with kind of spiky hair and her boyfriend Sluggo and some other people that they know. Ernie Bushmiller wrote and drew Nancy for many years. He created the characters. Actually, Nancy was a spin-off of an earlier character who was the first strip that he wrote. But Griffith wrote this wonderful graphic novel history biography of Ernie Bushmiller. And if you're at all attuned to Nancy the comic strip, I cannot recommend this highly enough. It really is terrific. It's also excellent in that it's a really good look at the comic strip newspaper industry as it evolved from the early 20th century in those syndicates throughout. It does not really follow much of the development of Nancy past Bushmiller's passing. The strip Nancy is still going strong. It's currently being written and drawn by a pseudonymous creator named Olivia James, I believe. And she's really brought the strip into the modern era, but still maintained that delightful kind of absurd humor, sometimes even breaking the plane of the comics, kind of in a fourth wall kind of way. That's fascinating and delightful to see. Another interesting thing that James is doing with Nancy now that I've noticed, even though the conceit still exists that Nancy is eternally unaging. She's like how Bart Simpson's been in the same grade in school for 30 years or whatever he's been on TV, and Nancy's the same way. But even so, if you follow it on a daily basis, you can see ongoing storylines and ongoing growth happens, development, which is really interesting to observe as it plays out amidst the fact that the strip does not progress in time, and yet in a way it does. That's pretty interesting. But anyway, 3 Rocks, the story of Ernie Bushmiller. Can't recommend that highly enough if you're interested either in comics or the character of Nancy. The first book by Griffith that I read was actually a different one because I had to request the 3 Rocks from my library. But he did a book called Invisible Ink, My Mother's Love Affair with a Famous Cartoonist. This is kind of Griffith's delving into family secrets that he would later discover after his mother had passed away. Basically found the skeletons in her closet and then started investigating them and studying them and figuring out what kind of things his mother was really doing throughout his childhood. And it's just a very fascinating, sometimes very moving look at the kind of secrets that shape family life that we might not even know about until many, many years later. The third major graphic novel that I read, or the one that really just made my life good last year, was Swords of the Swashbucklers by Bill Mantlo. Mantlo was a major name in comics during the 80s, probably into the 90s. Yeah, Swords of the Swashbucklers is actually a collection of all the issues from a series, a limited series he wrote and drew back in. Actually, I think he wrote it, I don't think he drew it. And it's just a very entertaining story with the kind of space opera where you actually have pirate ships with sails and rigging, flying through the sky. So that was a fascinating book, and I loved the art in it. I love the story. The story does feel like it ends kind of abruptly at the end, but I can forgive a lot of that sort of thing. He creates a fascinating world, and it was just a joy to read. Okay, moving on to nonfiction. Last year I read the 1619 Project. I'm not going to delve too much into it because there's just so much in that book that it's eye-opening, it's maddening, it's angering, rage-inducing, saddening, but maybe it's hopeful. Just those thoughts, those words keep getting out in there, and the ideas contained within, and the historical truths contained within, they become more and more, hopefully, mainstreamed. Maybe we can finally start as a society, as a country, to put those demons in our past aside. That is to be hoped. But I thought that was an amazing book, just full of incredible content. It took me a very long time to read it because it's dense and it's hard, and it's showing me things that I didn't want to see, or I should say I didn't want to see. I knew they were there to be seen, but they're still hard to look at. Alex Ross, the music critic for the New Yorker magazine, one of the best classical music writers in general, but he really sticks to classical in most of his writing. He has a collection of columns called Listen to This, which I read last year. His work is simply brilliant. He's on my list of, he puts out a book, I get it. A lot of topics in there. He writes about music education, what he thinks is going wrong with it. I think he wrote a chapter in there about some of his favorite bands. Don't remember offhand which ones they were, but he's a very versatile music writer. His prose is, lyrical and moving, and I can't recommend him highly enough. Seek out his columns in the New Yorker if you have access to that magazine. Definitely look for his books. And last was a book by an author named Patrick Bringley. This one is called All the Beauty in the World, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Me. This is a memoir by this writer who took a job as one of the guards/attendants at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And it turns out he did this in the wake of his brother passing of cancer. So there is something of that sort of sad note, bittersweet note behind it. But he describes, if you've ever seen those people lurking around, we've been in an art museum, lurking is not the bad word, but they stand in the corner and they kind of watch. And maybe once in a while they'll step forward and offer wisdom on a particular piece or something if they know something about it, but mostly they're just kind of quiet to make sure everybody's behaving, not touching the paintings and that sort of thing. He describes that kind of life, what that job is like. It was a really fascinating book to read, a particular book. Also made me regret the fact that when we were in New York City some years ago, we couldn't make it into the Met. We didn't have time on that particular trip. But we will get back there. I do want to see all the things that he talks about in this museum. I really enjoyed the fact that he says that people get disappointed to learn that the United States has no Da Vinci's. Well, I don't know what you would expect. I think there might be one somewhere, but it's not at the Met. And people come and say, "Where's the Da Vinci?" And he would have to go, "Don't have one." Anyway, going back to actual novels. One thing about me as a reader is I'm not good at reading what's really popular or what's highly acclaimed in a given year, in the year it comes out. Whatever the big novel is this year, I won't get to it probably for several years. In that vein, I read The Invention of Hugo Cabret by Selznick. Barry Selznick? Brian Selznick? All I wrote down was Selznick. I don't know why I did that. First names are good. This thing was just terrific. I owned a copy for years. I've never read it. Just sat there on my shelf. That shelf right over there. And finally, I thought this year or last year, why have I never read this? A lot of people have spoken very highly of it. It's time to knock this thing off. So I did. It's just an amazing illustrated novel. It's almost a graphic novel in prose, but it melds the two so incredibly beautifully. The art is just stunning, and the story is fascinating. It combines the steampunk and the setting of a Paris train station with all the various tunnels and passages hidden within it, and the lives of the people who live and work within this train station, where thousands of people are coming and going by train every day. The design, there's giant clocks, but then there's steam-driven, powered machines. There's an automaton, an actual figure of a man that's automatically driven. And then this all ties into somehow the early years of cinema, of film. And the way that all ties together is just incredibly brilliant. And I love this book unreservedly. It was just terrific. Later we watched the movie directed by Martin Scorsese. And that was just an amazing film too, every bit as good as the book, and it's very, very faithful. I'm glad Scorsese did that. Scorsese is so well known for his love of cinema, his intention to honor history of film every time he steps behind the camera. So I'm glad he made that film, and he really nailed it. Katherine Paterson wrote a book called Of Nightingales That Weep. This came out many, many years ago. It's a YA novel from 1974. And it's based kind of loosely on the tale of Genji, which is a work of Japanese literature from almost 1,000 years ago, if not actually 1,000 years ago. The tale of Genji is sometimes regarded as the very first actual novel ever written, the first work of literature in world history that can be considered a novel. And it tells the story, the often bloody story of two Japanese dynasties battling each other for the throne. But it is surprisingly unflinching in its depiction of a war society in medieval Japanese times, for what was expected for a 1974 YA novel. And it follows one young woman as she tries to find her place. She ends up rising somehow through the ranks into almost becoming nobility herself before the war ends, and she's on the wrong side of it. But that was a very impressive book. I'm very glad I read that. That's another one I've had on my shelf for a while. I don't even remember when I got it. The last novel that really stood out for me last year was A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Obviously a classic of children's literature. This has been around forever. I've got it in a Library of America edition, and I just finally decided it's time to reread that. I've had that book for a very long time as well. There's a young girl who lives in an orphanage. It's about her struggles to maintain her constant optimism, even as her life gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. It's kind of a story where the kid in the orphanage finds enemies she doesn't know she had, doesn't deserve, and she maintains her level of optimism. And there are some surprises along the way, and the way the book ends is it ends in a very satisfying way. I'll just leave it there in case you read it. It's a wonderful book. It was made into a highly regarded movie, I think, in the 90s. I didn't see the movie. Another Burnett novel became a movie that I love. It's called The Secret Garden. I have not yet read that book yet, but that's on my list. And then a couple rereads. Last year I reread The Lord of the Rings for the first time in many years. I used to reread Lord of the Rings every probably 3 or 4 years. This time somehow it got to be probably almost 10 years since I'd reread it last, which strikes me as odd and unusual. Whenever I reread Lord of the Rings, I always include The Hobbit. I consider that part of the entire story. I know that they're actually, as Tolkien intended, they're separate things, but I don't think The Lord of the Rings itself lands quite as well if you haven't read The Hobbit first. Plus, I just love Tolkien's writing. I love the tone that he writes with. Something just fell off my desk. Sorry. I love the tone that Tolkien writes with. I love his lyricism. And the books are filled with gentle, good humor. I laughed a lot while reading these books. There were things I didn't remember even since the last reread that made me laugh this time. Toward the end, during Aragorn's coronation, there's an annoying woman who just keeps loudly describing for her friend what's going on. We've all been around that person at the movie theater who keeps telling their friend what the plot is, and you're like, well, they shut up and I didn't remember that happening, so I was really glad I reread it this time. Dissing the Lord of the Rings has kind of become almost a little cottage industry online. I don't really understand that. Quite a few writers will actually say that they've never read it, they've never been able to read it, they just can't get into it. The language is just too dense. I have never found that. Many people say that the movies, the Peter Jackson films, are a better telling of the story. I can't get there either. There are a lot of places in the story where I think what Tolkien does makes more sense than what Peter Jackson does. One example is the breaking of the Fellowship. There's no scene in the books where Aragorn says to Frodo, I would have gone with you to Mordor before he sends him off. That whole episode happens very differently, and Aragorn has to make choices, not without having all the information in hand, and he does the best he can, and it's just it makes a lot more sense in the books than it does in the movies. Likewise, toward the end of the Two Towers, when Tolkien has to get Frodo and Gollum by themselves in Shelob's lair. This happens at the end of the book, Two Towers. In the movies, this is in Return of the King. I always found the Peter Jackson, framing of Sam for having eaten the bread was kind of, that felt a little weak. That's a lot more convincing in the books as well. But the character Faramir turns out much better in the books than he does in the movies as well. But those are all quibbles. I mean, the movies are brilliant, but the books are just on a different plane. I love those books. I'm sure I hope to reread them at least 3, 4, 5, 6 more times before I'm done. The other rereading I did was 2 serial killer novels by a man named Caleb Carr, The Alienist and Angel of Darkness. These are both period books set around the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century. This was back when forensic science, forensic investigation was not nearly as developed as it is now. Fingerprinting was brand new. Most people didn't even trust it. Psychology and psychiatry were brand new. Very few people trusted those things as well. And they follow there's a great detective, that archetype, named Dr. Laszlo Kreisler, who was a brilliant psychiatrist. At the time, they called them alienists, hence the title of the first book. And it tracks Dr. Laszlo Kreisler and his associates as they pursue 2 different killers who have very disturbing methods, very disturbing preferred targets, very disturbing motivations. These books are really effective in their world building, their depiction of the New York City of that era. I do think sometimes Mr. Carr gets a little too interested in name dropping. I think he goes a little too far into making sure that certain historical figures from those periods appear in his books. At one point in The Alienist, John Pierpont Morgan shows up. It's like, that's not totally convincing. Does something similar in Angel of Darkness, which is the sequel, with a different major historical figure. That one's a little more convincing, because it actually works in terms of the story and what that particular character was known for doing in history. I will say stylistically, Mr. Carr's writing is a bit more dense and wordy than I tend to like at this point in my life. I was kind of surprised that occasionally I was like, wow, these paragraphs are really long. I don't remember that being the case before. But that's not really a complaint. There's a third book in this series that Mr. Carr wrote. I have not yet read it. And it actually takes place, I believe, in present day, and then draws on lessons from the great detective, Dr. Kreisler before. And I'm really interested to read that. That's on my TBR for this year. Kind of fascinated by that approach. It'd be like if someone wrote a detective story set in, Scotland Yard in London, and they're looking at, and the lead in that particular story is looking at cases left behind by a very real Dr. Sherlock, Professor or Inspector Sherlock Holmes, who had been around many years before. So those are the major highlights of my reading life in 2023. I am on Goodreads, so you can look me up there. I think I read about 52, 53 books last year. That tends to be my goal each year. Right now, I'm ahead of it for 2024, so yay me. I will say on Goodreads, I don't tend to write very long reviews. I use Goodreads just as a way of tracking my own reading for my own purposes. My reviews tend to be like just a couple sentences, so I remember briefly what I thought of a book and whether or not I liked it, or how much I liked it. And it's basically to remind me that I read it in a lot of cases. I very rarely mark things as DNF in case the only time I mark something as DNF is if I really want to remind myself later on, I started this for whatever reason, I didn't want to finish it, and I'm just warning myself off it the next time. I DNF a lot, but I also come back to books a lot later on. I found over the years that DNFing a book, it's more about my mood at the time than whether or not I really like the book. And a lot of my favorite books of all time are books I DNF'd the first time through. The Lord of the Rings I DNF'd the first time through. Favorite author of all time, or my favorite living author, I should say, is Canadian author Guy Gabriel Kay. I DNF'd him the very first time I tried reading one of his books. A lot of my most beloved books were DNFs the first time, so I never hold it against a book that I didn't finish it the first time, and I don't give it a bad review because I didn't finish it. Likewise, I only review books that I finish, and I only finish books that I'm enjoying reading. So the upshot there is that most of my reviews will be positive. I give very, very few negative reviews because I don't think it's fair to negatively review something that I didn't finish, and if I'm not enjoying it, I'm going to stop reading it. And like I said, I don't hold it against a book if I DNF'd it. So if you look at my Goodreads, you'll think, wow, this guy likes everything. That's not quite true. I only review what I like, what I finish. 3 stars for me is, perfectly good book. I'm glad I read it. No worries about it. 4 stars is, wow, this is really superb. Really enjoyed this. This was terrific. 5 stars for me is, wow, if I'm ever on that island with Tom Hanks, I want this book with me. That's generally how I approach things. I do wish Goodreads had the granularity of half stars. I will sometimes mention in my review, like if I gave a book 4 stars, I might say this is actually maybe 4.5. If we give it a 3, this is like a 3.5. I do try to mention that. I'm not a big fan of star ratings, but they are there and they're somewhat useful. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up now. Hit the like button if you will. Subscribe if you will. Do both those things anyway. It's not going to kill you. I mean, come on. What do you got to lose? Anyway, I'm going to sign out now and catch you later.